There we go. Science! Welcome back to another thrilling installment of I Haven't Hit the Button Yet. No, I did. Never mind. It's gonna be one of those days. I got it. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Fraggoth Reads. I'm Fraggoth, and today we'll be reading Distress by Greg Egan. Previously on, Andrew Worth, our journalist protagonist, has finally found out what these AC people are. Anthrocosmologists. That's literally all we know. Other than there is some tie between them and Violet Mosala, and there is some... And this woman that he met, this sociologist that he met on the plane and now on Stateless, has been researching them, interviewing them, had discussions with them. Also, this Kuale person that he met when he first landed. But that's about all we know about who they are. We did have an interesting kind of surreal sequence of seeing how the island is constantly constructing itself and being deconstructed at the same time by the elements and the engineered lithophages that are constantly depositing rock as they do their thing, metabolize, presumably, the materials, raw materials of the ocean around them. That's most of it. Those are the highlights. So, page are we on here? About there, that sounds about right. Cool. In that case, let's plop this bookmark right around here, see how long that takes to get through, and we'll figure it out from there. Yikes, the chapter after that is really long, so we probably will be fairly short today, but we'll see how we're doing. Anyway, the plot thickens. Things are sort of up in the air at the moment. We don't really know what's going on, and it's been long enough since I read this that I don't really remember what's going on. I believe I know how how things are going to turn out, but I'll be honest. It's been long enough. And by long enough, I mean at least 5 years since I read this last. And I've read a lot of things since. Yeah, what year is my edition that I've got? And I know I got it after it was printed. 2015. I could imagine I had it as early as like 2018, 2019, so, and I don't think I waited that long before reading it, no more than a year, so yeah, at least 5 years it's been since I've read this. Anyway, with that, let me gulp some water to freshen out my throat parts and mouth parts. Start energizing my brain elements, and start rocking and rolling. Chapter 15. I arrived early for Helen Wu's lecture. The auditorium was almost empty, but Mosala was there, studying something on her notepad intently. I took a seat one space removed from her. She didn't look up. "Good morning." She glanced at me and replied coldly, "Good morning," then went back to whatever she was viewing.
If I kept filming her like this, the audience would conclude that the whole documentary had been made at gunpoint. Body language could always be edited. That wasn't the point, though. I said, "How does this sound? I promise not to use anything you said about the cults yesterday, if you agree to give me something more considered later on." She thought it over without lifting her eyes from the screen. "All right, that's fair." She glanced at me again, adding, "I don't mean to be rude, but I really do have to finish this." She showed me her notepad. She was halfway through one of Wu's papers, a physical review article about 6 months old. I didn't say anything, but I must have looked momentarily scandalized. Mosala said defensively, "There are only 24 hours in a day. Of course I should have read this months ago, but—" She gestured impatiently. "Can I film you reading it?" She was horrified. "And let everyone know?" I said, "Nobel laureate catches up on homework. It would show that you have something in common with us mortals." I almost added, "It's what we call humanization." Mosala said firmly, "You can start filming when the lecture begins. That's what it says on the schedule we agreed to, right?" "Right." She carried on reading, now truly ignoring me. All the self-consciousness and hostility had vanished. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Between us, we'd probably just saved the documentary. Her reaction to the cults had to be dealt with, but she had a right to express it more diplomatically. It was a simple, obvious compromise. I only wished I'd thought of it sooner. I peeked at Mosala's notepad while she read, without recording. She invoked some kind of software assistant every time she came to an equation. Windows blossomed on the screen, full of algebraic cross-checking and detailed analysis of the links between the steps in Wu's argument. I wondered if I would have been able to make better sense of Wu's papers myself with this kind of help. Probably not. Some of the notation in the explanatory windows looked even more cryptic to me than that of the original text. I could follow, in the broadest qualitative terms, most of the issues being discussed at the conference. But Mosala, with a little computerized help, could clearly penetrate right down to the level where the mathematics either survived rigorous scrutiny or fell apart. No seductive rhetoric, no persuasive metaphors, no appeals to intuition, just a sequence of equations where each one did or did not lead inexorably to the next. Passing this inspection wasn't proof of anything, of course. An immaculate chain of reasoning led to nothing but an elegant fantasy if the premises were, physically, wrong. It was crucial to be able to test the connections themselves, though, to check every strand in the web of logic which bound two possibilities together. The way I saw it, every theory and its logical consequences, every set of general laws and the specific possibilities they dictated, formed an indivisible whole. Newton's universal laws of motion and gravity, Kepler's idealized elliptical orbits, and any number of particular, pre-Einsteinian, models of the solar system were all part of the same fabric of ideas, the same tightly knit layer of reasoning. None of which had turned out to be entirely correct, so the whole layer of Newtonian cosmology had been peeled away. Fingernails slipped under the unraveling corner where velocities approached the speed of light, in search of something deeper, and the same thing had happened 6 times since. The trick was to know precisely what constituted each layer, to prize away each interlinked set of falsified ideas and failed predictions, no more and no less, until a layer was reached which was seamless, self-consistent, and which fit every available observation of the real world. That was what set Violet Mosala apart from half her colleagues, no doubt, as well as third-rate science journalists, and which no amount of humanization would ever change. If a proposed TOE was inconsistent with experimental data or unraveled under its own contradictions, she had the ability to follow the logic as far as it went and peel away the whole beautiful failure like a perfect sheet of dead skin. And if it wasn't a beautiful failure? If the TOE in question turned out to be flawless? Watching her parse Wu's elaborate mathematical arguments as if they were written in the most transparent prose, I could picture her, when that day came, whether the TOE was her own or not, patiently mapping out the theory's consequences at every scale, every energy, every level of complexity, doing her best to weave the universe into an indivisible whole. The auditorium began to fill. Mosala finished the paper just as Wu arrived at the podium. I whispered, "What's the verdict?" Mosala was pensive. "I think she's largely correct. She hasn't quite proved what she set out to prove. Not yet. But I'm almost certain that she's on the right track." I was startled. "But doesn't that worry?" She raised a finger to her lips. "Be patient. Let's hear her out." Helen Wu lived in Malaysia, but had worked for the University of Bombay for the last 30 years. She'd co-authored at least a dozen seminal papers, including 2 with Buzzo and 1 with Mosala, but somehow she'd never reached the same quasi-celebrity status. She was probably every bit as ingenious and imaginative as Buzzo, and maybe even as rigorous and thorough as Mosala, but she seemed to have been slower to move straight to the frontiers of the field, always really visible only in retrospect, and not as lucky in choosing problems which had yielded spectacular general results. Much of the lecture was simply beyond me. I covered every word, every graphic scrupulously, but my thoughts wandered to the question of how I could paraphrase the message without the technicalities. With an interactive dialogue, maybe? Pick a number between 10 and 1,000. Don't tell me what it is. Thinks. 575. Add the digits together. 17. Add them again. 8. Add 3. 11. Subtract this from the original number. 564. Add the digits together. 15. Find the remainder left when you divide by 9. 6. Square it. 36. Add 6. 42. The number in your head now is 42? Yes. Now, try it once again. The end result, of course, was guaranteed to be the same every time. All the elaborate steps of this cheap party trick were just a long-winded way of saying that x minus x would always equal 0. Wu was suggesting that Mosala's whole approach to building a TOE amounted to much the same thing. All the mathematics simply cancelled itself out. On a grander scale, and in a far less obvious manner, but in the end, a tautology was still a tautology. Sorry, my lips are rebelling. I might have to put on some lip balm or something. Wu spoke quietly as equations flowed across the display screen behind her. To spell out these connections, to short-circuit one part of Mosala's work with another, Wu had had to prove half a dozen new theorems in pure mathematics. Difficult results, all of them, and useful in their own right. This was not my own uneducated opinion. I'd checked the databases for citations of her earlier work, which had prepared the ground for this presentation. And that was the extraordinary thing for me, that such a rich and complex restatement of x minus x equals 0 was even possible. It was as if an elaborately twisted length of rope, weaving in and out of its own detours a few 100,000 times, had turned out not to be knotted at all, but just a simple loop, ornately arranged, but ultimately able to be completely untangled. Maybe that would make a better metaphor, and in the interactive, viewers with force gloves could reach in and prove for themselves that the knot really was just a loop in disguise. You couldn't grab hold of a couple of Mosala's tensor equations and simply tug, though, to find out how they were joined. You had to unpick the false knot in your mind's eye, with help from software, but it couldn't do everything. Subtle mistakes were always possible. The details were everything. Wu finished and began taking questions. The audience was subdued. There were only a couple of tentative requests for clarification, expressing no hint of acceptance or rejection. I turned to Mosala. "Do you still think she's on the right track?" She hesitated. Yes, I do. The auditorium was emptying around us. In the corner of my eye, I could see people's gaze lingering on Mosala as they made their way past us. It was all very civilized, no swooning teenagers begging for autographs, but there were unmistakable flashes of infatuation, reverence, adoration. I recognized some members of the fan club whose support had been so evident at the press conference, but I still hadn't so much as glimpsed Kuale anywhere in the building. If V was so concerned about Mosala, why wasn't V here? I said, "What does that mean for your TOE? If Wu is correct—" Mosala smiled. "Maybe that strengthens my position." "Why? I don't understand." She glanced at her notepad. "It's a complicated issue. Maybe we could go into it tomorrow?" Wednesday afternoon. Our first interview session. Of course. We began to walk out together. Mosala clearly had another appointment. It was now or never. I said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you. I don't know if it's important, but—" She seemed distracted, but she said, "Go on." When I arrived, I was met at the airport by someone called Akili Kuale. She didn't react to the name, so I continued. "Vi said vi was a mainstream anthrocosmologist, and—" Mosala groaned softly, closed her eyes, and stopped dead. Then she turned on me. "Let me make this absolutely clear. If you so much as mention the anthrocosmologists in this documentary, I'll—" I broke in hurriedly. "I have no intention of doing that." She stared at me angrily, disbelieving. I added, "Do you think they'd let me, even if I wanted to?" She wasn't mollified. "I never know what they might do. What did this person want from you, if it wasn't coverage for their lunatic views?" I said carefully, "We seem to feel you might be in some kind of danger." I contemplated raising the question of emigration to Stateless, but Mosala was already so close to Flashpoint that I didn't think it was worth the risk. She said acidly, "Well, that's the anthrocosmologists for you, and their concern is very touching, but I'm not in any danger, am I?" She gestured at the empty auditorium as if to point out the absence of lurking assassins. "So they can relax and you can forget about them, and we can both get on with our jobs. Right?" I nodded dumbly. She started to walk away. I caught up with her. I said, "Look, I didn't seek these people out. I was approached straight off the plane by this mysterious person making cryptic remarks about your safety. I thought you had a right to hear about it. It's as simple as that. I didn't know if he was a member of your least favorite cult, and if the whole subject's taboo, fine. I'll never speak their name in your presence again." Mosala stopped, her expression softening. She said, "I apologize. I didn't mean to chew your head off, but if you knew the kind of pernicious nonsense—" She broke off. "Never mind. You say the subject's closed? You have no interest in them?" She smiled sweetly. "Then there's nothing to argue about, is there?" She walked to the doorway, then turned and called back. "So, I'll see you tomorrow afternoon? We can finally have a talk about some things that matter. I'm looking forward to that." I watched her walk away, then I retreated back into the empty room and sat down in a front row seat, wondering how I'd ever talked myself into believing that I could explain Violet Mosala to the world. I hadn't even known what my own lover was thinking, living with her week after week. So what kind of ludicrous misjudgments would I make with this highly strung, mercurial stranger, whose life revolved around mathematics I could barely comprehend? My notepad beeped urgently. I took it from my pocket. Hermes had deduced that the lecture was over, and audible signaling was now acceptable. There was a message for me from Indrani Lee. "Andrew, you may not fully appreciate what kind of a coup this is, but a representative of the people we discussed last night has agreed to speak with you. Off the record, of course. 27 Chomsky Avenue, 9 o'clock tonight." I clutched my stomach and tried not to laugh. I said, "I'm not going. I'm not risking it. What if Mosala finds out? Of course I'm curious, but it's just not worth it." After a few seconds, Hermes asked, "Is that a reply to the sender?" I shook my head. "No, and it's not even the truth either." The address Lee had given me was a short walk from the northeast tram line, through what looked, almost, like a patch of middle-class suburbia back home, except that there was no vegetation, ostentatious or otherwise, just relatively large paved courtyards and occasional kitsch statuary. No obviously electrified fences, either. The air was chilly. Autumn was making itself felt here, after all. The dazzling coral of Stateless gave the wrong impression entirely. The natural cousins of its engineered polyps would not have thrived this far from the tropics. I thought, Sarah Knight had been in touch with the Anthrocosmologists, and Mosala had never got to hear of it. She would hardly have spoken about Sarah in such glowing terms if she'd known that there'd been some kind of deal between her and Kuale. That was pure supposition, but it made sense. Research for holding up the sky must have led Sarah to the ACs, who were at least part of the reason why she'd worked so hard to get the contract for Violet Mosala. And maybe the Anthrocosmologists had now decided to offer the same deal to me. Help us keep watch over Violet Mosala, and we'll give you a world exclusive, the first media coverage of the planet's most secretive cult. Why did they feel that it was their duty to guard Mosala, though? What role did TOE specialists play in the Anthrocosmologists' scheme of things? Revered gurus? Unworldly holy fools who needed to be protected from their enemies by a secret cadre of devoted followers? Sanctifying physicists would make a change from sanctifying ignorance, but I could imagine Mosala finding it even more galling to be told that she was some kind of precious, but ultimately naive and helpless, conduit for mystical insights, than to be told she was in need of being humbled or healed. There's those H words again. Number 27 was a single-story house of silver-gray granite like reef rock. Whoa, whoops, got my hyphens mixed up. So, I'm going to read this out again properly, and then I'm going to read you how many hyphens are there. Number 27 was a single-story house of silver-gray granite-like reef rock. So, there are more hyphens than you can shake a stick at. It reads, number 27, the word number, 27, was a single-story house of silver-gray, granite-like, reef-rock. There's something very poetic about that. Number 27 was a single-story house of silver-gray granite-like reef rock. It was large, but no mansion. 4 or 5 bedrooms, maybe. It made sense for the reclusive ACs to lease themselves something out in the suburbs. It was certainly more discreet than booking themselves rooms in a hotel swarming with journalists. Warm yellow light showed through windows set to opalescent, a deliberately welcoming configuration. I walked through the unlocked gate, crossed the empty courtyard, steeled myself, and rang the bell. If mystical Renaissance could don clown costumes and talk about imagination-driven self-narratives out on the street for all the world to see, I wasn't sure I was ready for a cult whose practices had to take place behind closed doors. My notepad emitted a brief, soft squeal like a children's toy impaled on a knife. I took it from my pocket. The screen was blank, the first time I'd ever seen it that way. The door opened, and an elegantly dressed woman smiled at me and extended a hand, saying, "You must be Andrew Worth. I'm Amanda Conroy." "Pleased to meet you." Still clutching my notepad, I shook her hand. She glanced at the dead machine. "It won't be damaged, but you understand this is off the record." Oh, no. She had a West Coast U.S. accent. "It won't be damaged." No, that's too Valley Girl. I don't think I could do a Californian accent, actually. I should practice that. "Wow, it won't be damaged." Nicolas Cage. I don't know. She had a West Coast U.S. accent and unashamedly unnatural milk-white skin, smooth as polished marble. She might have been any age from 30 to 60. I followed her into the house, down a plushly carpeted hallway, and into the living room. There were 6 wall hangings, large, abstract, and colorful. They looked to me like Brazilian mock primitive, the work of a school of fashionable Irish artists, but I had no way of knowing whether or not they were the genuine article. Self-consciously exploitative remixes of 20s Sao Paulo ghetto art currently valued at 100,000 times the price of the real thing from Brazil. The 4-meter wall screen certainly wasn't cheap, though, and nor was the hidden device which had turned my notepad into a brick. I didn't even contemplate trying to invoke witness. I was just glad I'd transmitted the morning's footage to my editing console at home before leaving the hotel. We seemed to be alone in the room. Conroy said, "Take a seat, please. Can I offer you anything?" She moved toward a small beverage dispenser in a corner of the room. I glanced at the machine and declined. It was a $20,000 synthesizer model, essentially a scaled-up farm. It could have served anything from orange juice to a cocktail of neuroactive amines. Its presence on Stateless surprised me. I hadn't been allowed to bring my own out-of-date farm here, but not having memorized the schedules to the UN resolution, I wasn't sure what technology was prohibited universally and what was banned only from Australian exports. Conroy sat opposite me, composed but thoughtful for a moment. Then she said, "Achille Kawale is a very dear friend of mine, and a wonderful person, but he's something of a loose cannon." She smiled disarmingly. "I can't imagine what impression you have of us after we led you on with all that cloak and dagger nonsense." She glanced at my notepad again, meaningfully. "I suppose our insistence on strict privacy doesn't help matters either, but there's nothing sinister about that, I assure you. You must appreciate the power of the media to take a group of people and their ideas and distort the representation of both to suit any number of agendas." I started to reply. To concede the point, actually, but she cut me off. "I'm not trying to libel your profession, but we've seen it happen so many times to other groups that you shouldn't be surprised if we treat it as an inevitable consequence of going public. So we've made the difficult choice, for the sake of autonomy, to refuse to be represented by outsiders at all. We don't wish to be portrayed to the world at large, fairly or unfairly, sympathetically or otherwise. And if we have no public image whatsoever, the problem of distortion vanishes. We are who we are." I said, "And yet you've asked me here." Conroy nodded regretfully. "Wasting your time and risking making things even worse. But what choice did we have? Achilles stirred your curiosity, and we could hardly expect you to let the matter drop. So I'm willing to discuss our ideas with you directly, rather than leaving you to track down and piece together a lot of unreliable hearsay from third parties. But it must all be off record." I shifted in my seat. "You don't want me drawing any more attention to you by asking questions of the wrong people, so you'll answer them yourself, just to shut me up?" I'd expected this blunt appraisal to be met with wounded denials and a barrage of euphemisms, but Conroy replied calmly, "That's right." Indrani Lee must have taken my suggestion at face value. Just say I asked you more or less at random, that I've been asking everyone at the conference, and I just happened to include you. If the ACs thought my hastily improvised story for Lee about the vanishing informant, Kawale, was in the process of being repeated to every last journalist and physicist on Stateless, no wonder they'd wasted no time in calling me in. I said, "Why are you willing to trust me? What's to stop me from using everything you say?" Conroy spread her hands. "Nothing. But why would you want to do that? I've viewed your previous work. It's clear that quasi-scientific groups like us don't interest you. You're here to cover Violet Mosala at the Einstein Conference, which must be a challenging enough subject without any detours and distractions. It may be impossible to leave mystical renaissance or humble science out of the picture. They're forcing themselves into the frame at every opportunity. But we're not. And with no images of us, unless you care to fake them, what would you put in your documentary? A 5-minute interview with yourself recounting this meeting? I didn't know what to say. She was right on every count. And on top of all that was Mosala's antipathy, and the risk I ran of losing her cooperation if I was caught straying into this territory at all. What's more, I couldn't help but sympathize a little with the AC's stand. It seemed that almost everyone I'd encountered in the last few years, from gender migrants fleeing other people's definitions of sexual politics to refugees from nationalist cant like Bill Monroe, was weary of having someone else claim the authority to portray them. Even the ignorance cults and TOE specialists resented each other for similar reasons, although they were ultimately contesting the definition of something infinitely larger than their own identities. I said cautiously, "I can hardly offer you a vow of unconditional secrecy, but I'll try to respect your wishes." This seemed to be enough for Conroy. Perhaps she'd weighed up everything before we'd even met, and decided that a quiet briefing had to be the lesser of two evils, even if she could extract no guarantees. She said, "Anthrocosmology is really just the modern form of an ancient idea. I won't waste your time, though, listing what we do and don't have in common with various philosophers of classical Greece, the early Islamic world, 17th century France, or 18th century Germany. You can mine all the distant history yourself if you really care. I'll start with a man I'm sure you've heard of, a 20th century physicist called John Wheeler." I nodded recognition, although all I could recall immediately was that he'd played a seminal role in the theory of black holes. Conroy continued, "Wheeler was a great advocate of the idea of a participatory universe, a universe shaped by the inhabitants who observe and explain it. He had a favorite metaphor for this concept. Do you know the old game of 20 questions? One person thinks of an object, and the other keeps asking yes or no questions to try to find out what it is. There's another way to play the game, though. You don't choose any object at all to start with. You just answer the questions yes or no more or less at random, but constrained by the need to be consistent with what you've already said. If you've said that it is blue all over, you can't change your mind later and say that it's red, even though you still have no precise idea what it really is. But as more and more questions are asked, what it might be becomes narrower and narrower. Wheeler suggested that the universe itself behaved like that undefined object, only coming into being as something specific through a similar process of interrogation. We make observations, we carry out experiments, we ask questions about it. We get back answers, some of them more or less random, but they're never absolute contradictions. And the more questions we ask, the more precisely the universe takes shape." I said, "You mean like making measurements on microscopic objects? Some properties of subatomic particles don't exist until they're measured, and the measurement you get has a random component. But if you measure the same thing a second time, you get the same result." This was old ground, well established and uncontroversial. Surely that's the kind of thing Wheeler would have meant? Conroy agreed. That's the definitive example, which dates back to Niels Bohr, of course, and Wheeler was one of his students in Copenhagen in the 1930s. Quantum measurement was certainly the inspiration for the whole model. Wheeler and his successors took it further, though. Quantum measurement is about individual microscopic events which do or don't happen at random, but according to probabilities determined by a set of pre-existing laws. About individual heads and tails, not the shape of the coin or the overall odds when it's thrown repeatedly. It's easy enough to see that a coin is neither heads nor tails while it's still up in the air, spinning. But what if it's not even any particular coin? What if there really are no pre-existing laws governing the system you're about to measure, any more than there are pre-existing answers to any of those measurements? I said warily, "You tell me." I'd come here expecting a serve of the usual florid cult speak from the very start, gibberish about archetypal warlocks and witches, or the urgent need to rediscover the lost wisdom of the alchemists. The strategy of taking quantum mechanics and distorting the boundaries of its counterintuitive weirdness in whatever direction suited the cult philosophy was far harder to track. In the hands of a smooth-talking charlatan, QM could be blurred into just about anything, from a scientific basis for telepathy to a proof of Zen Buddhism. Still, I couldn't gauge the precise moment when Conroy moved from established science to anthrocosmological fantasy. That hardly mattered. Oh, still, if I couldn't gauge the precise moment when Conroy moved from established science to anthrocosmological fantasy, that hardly mattered. I could map it all out later, when I had my electronic teat back, giving me access to some expert guidance. Conroy smiled at my edginess, and continued in the language of science. What happened, historically, was that physics merged with information theory. Or at least a lot of people explored the union for a while. They tried to discover whether it made sense to talk about building, not just a space-time of individual microscopic events, but all of the underlying quantum mechanics and all of the various, then non-unified, field equations. Out of nothing but a stream of yes and no answers. Reality from information, from an accumulation of knowledge. As Wheeler put it, an it from a bit. I said, "Sounds like one of those nice ideas that just didn't pan out. No one at the conference is talking about anything of the kind." Conroy conceded. Information physics pretty much vanished from serious contention when the standard unified field theory rose from the ashes of superstrings. What did the geometry of 10-dimensional total space have to do with the sequences of bits? Very little. Geometry took over, and it's been the most productive approach ever since. So where do the Anthrocosmologists fit in? Do you have your own information physics? Rival TOEs, which the establishment won't take seriously? Conroy laughed. Hardly. We couldn't begin to compete in that arena, and we have no wish to do so. Buzo, Mosala, and Nishide can fight it out between themselves. One of them will come up with a flawless TOE in the end. I'm certain of that. Then go back to the old Wheeler model of the universe. Laws of physics emerge from patterns, consistencies, in random data. But just as an event doesn't take place unless it's observed, a law doesn't exist until it's understood. The question then is, understood by whom? Who decides what consistent means? Who decides what form a law can take, or what constitutes an explanation? If the universe instantly succumbed to any human explanation whatsoever, we'd be living in a world where Stone Age cosmology was literally true. Or it would be like the old satires of the afterlife, a separate heaven for every conflicting faith, even before we died. But the world just isn't like that. However much people disagree, we still find ourselves together, arguing about the nature of reality. We don't float off into individual universes where our own private explanations are ultimate truth. Well, no. I had a vivid image of the mystical Renaissance theater troupe following Carl Jung, dressed in a Pied Piper costume, down a psychedelic wormhole into another cosmos entirely, where no rationalists could follow. Rationalists. I said, "Doesn't that suggest to you that the universe might not be participatory after all? That the laws just might be fixed principles, independent of the people who understand them?" "No." Conroy smiled gently, as if this suggestion struck her as quaintly naive. "Everything in relativity and quantum mechanics cries out against any absolute backdrop, absolute time, absolute history, absolute laws. But I think it does suggest that the whole idea of participation needs to be formulated rigorously in the mathematics of information theory, and different possibilities analyzed with great care." It was hard to argue with that. To what end, though? If you're not competing for the discovery of a successful TOE, the point is to understand the means by which TOE science can give rise to an active TOE. How knowledge of the equations can fix the reality they describe firmly in place, so firmly that we can't even hope to see behind them, to glimpse the process which holds them there. I laughed. If you admit we can't hope to do that, you've just crossed right over into metaphysics. Conroy was unfazed. "Certainly, but we believe it still can be done in the spirit of science. applying logic, using appropriate mathematical tools. That's what anthrocosmology is, the old information theoretic approach, revived as something external to physics. It may not be needed to discover the TOE itself, but I believe it can make sense of the fact that there is a TOE at all. I leaned forward. I think I was smiling, almost unwillingly, fascinated in spite of my skepticism. As cult pseudoscience went, at least this was high-class bullshit. How exactly? Which of these possibilities you've analyzed with great care can give a theory any kind of power which wasn't already there in nature? Conroy said,
Oh, jeez.
Imagine this cosmology. Forget about starting the universe with just the right finely tuned Big Bang needed to create stars, planets, intelligent life, and a culture capable of making sense of it all. Instead, take as your starting point the fact that there's a living human being who can explain an entire universe in terms of a single theory. Turn everything around and take it as the only thing given that this one person exists. I said irritably, How can it be the only thing? You can't have a living human being and nothing else. And if it's given that this person can explain the universe, then there has to be a universe to explain. Exactly. Conroy smiled calmly and sanely, but the hairs stood up on the back of my neck, and I suddenly knew what she was going to say next. From this person, the universe grows out of the power to explain it out in all direction. Oh, whoops. There's a colon there. From this person, the universe grows out of the power to explain it. Out in all directions and forward and backward in time. Instead of being blasted out of pre-space, instead of being caused inexplicably at the beginning of time, it crystallizes quietly around a single human being. That's why the universe obeys a single law, a theory of everything. It's all explained by a single person. We call this one person the keystone. Everyone and everything exists because the keystone exists. The Big Bang model of cosmology can lead to anything at all. A universe of cold dust, a universe of black holes, a universe of dead planets. But the keystone needs everything which the universe actually contains, stars, planets, life, in order to explain his own existence. And not only needs them, the keystone can account for all of them, make sense of all of them, without gaps, without flaws, without contradictions. That's why it's possible for billions of people to be wrong. That's why we're not living with Stone Age cosmology, or even Newtonian physics. Most explanations just aren't powerful, rich, or coherent enough to bring a whole universe into being, and to explain a mind capable of holding such an explanation. I sat and stared at Conroy, not wishing to insult her, but at a loss for anything polite to say. This was pure cult speak at last. She might as well have been telling me that Violet Mosala and Henry Buzzo were the incarnations of a pair of warring Hindu deities. Or that Atlantis would rise from the ocean and the stars would fall from the sky when the final equation was written. Except that, if she had, I doubt I would have felt the same uneasy tingling down my back and across my forearms. She'd steered close enough to the shores of science, for enough of the way, to disarm me a little. She continued, We can't watch the universe emerge. We're part of it. We're trapped inside the space-time created by the act of explanation. All we can hope to witness in the progression of time is one person become the first to hold the TOE in his mind and grasp its consequences and, invisibly, imperceptibly, understand us all into being. She laughed suddenly, breaking the spell. It's only a theory. The mathematics behind it make perfect sense. But the reality is untestable by its very nature. So, of course, we could be wrong. But now, can you understand why someone like Achille, who believes, perhaps too passionately, that we could be right, wishes to be certain that Violet Mosala will come to no harm? I walked further south than I needed to, heading for a tram stop some way down the line from the point where I'd disembarked. I needed to be out under the stars for a while to come back down to Earth, even if Stateless didn't exactly qualify as solid ground. I was greatly relieved by the night's revelations. They seemed to wrap up everything, to make sense, finally, of all the distractions which had been keeping me from doing my job. The ACs were harmless cranks, and, entertaining as it might be to give them a footnote in Violet Mosala, it would hardly undermine the integrity of the whole documentary to leave them out, as they wished, as Mosala wished. Why offend both parties in the name of fearless journalism, in reality just to raise a brief smirk with CNET's target audience? And Kuale was, understandably, if not justifiably, thoroughly paranoid. The life of a potential keystone was not a matter to be taken lightly. It wasn't a question of the universe crumbling. If you died before explaining everything into being, then obviously someone else would have to do it, and you simply weren't the one. That didn't exclude a great deal of reverence, though, for the, as yet, mere candidate creators, and the rumor of Mosala's emigration must have been near enough to start Kuale seeing enemies crawling out of the reef rock. I waited for the tram on a deserted street, gazing up through the clear, cold air at a dazzling richness of stars and satellites. Conroy's perversely elegant fantasy still running through my head. I thought, if Mosala is the keystone, it's a good thing that she treats the ACs with such contempt. If her explanation of the universe included a conventional TOE and nothing else, then all was fine. If she'd taken Anthrocosmology seriously, though, surely that would have plucked her right out of the tight web of explanation she was supposed to be spinning for us all. A theory of everything wasn't a theory of everything if there was another level, a deeper layer of truth. And it seemed a sufficiently tall order to have to grow your own universe to wrap yourself in. Your own ancestors, needed to explain your own existence, your own billions of human cousins, an unavoidable logical consequence, as would be more distant relatives, animal and plant, your own world to stand on, sun to orbit, and other planets, suns, galaxy, not obviously essential for survival, but possibly allowing a relatively simple TOE, which could fit in one mind, to be traded for a trickier version which was more economical with cosmic real estate. Explaining all that into existence would be hard enough. You wouldn't want to be obliged to create the power to create it as well. To have to explain into being the Anthrocosmology which allowed you to explain things into being. A wise separation of powers. Leave the metaphysics to someone else. I boarded the tram. A couple of passengers smiled and greeted me and chatted for a while, without anyone drawing a weapon or demanding money. Walking up the street toward the hotel, I scrolled through a few documents on my notepad just to check that nothing had been lost in the blackout. I'd made a list of the questions I'd planned to ask the Anthrocosmologists. I checked through them to see how I'd done. I'd only missed one point. Not bad for someone used to a permanent electronic crutch, but it was still an irritation. Kuale had said that V was mainstream AC, so if all of the wild metaphysics which Conroy had just fed me was the mainstream of anthrocosmology, what did they believe out on the fringe? My complacency was beginning to unravel. All I'd heard was one version of the AC's doctrine. Conroy had taken it upon herself to speak for all of them, but that didn't prove that they all agreed. At the very least, I needed to speak to Kuale again, but I had better things to do than stake out the house in the hope that V would turn up there. Back in my room, I had Hermes scan the world's communication directories. There were over 7,000 Kuales listed, with primary addresses in a dozen countries, but no Achille. Which meant it was probably a nickname, a diminutive, or an unofficial nom de-sex. Without even knowing what country V came from, it was going to be impossible to narrow the search. I hadn't filmed my conversation with Kuale, but I closed my eyes and invoked Witness and played with the identikit option until I had Viz's face clearly in front of me, in digital form in my gut memory as well as my mind's eye. I plugged in the umbilical fiber and moved the image into my notepad, then searched the global news databases for a match to either name or face. Not everyone had their 15 minutes of fame, but with 9 million non-profit netzines on top of all the commercial media, you didn't exactly have to be a celebrity to make it into the archives. With an agrotech competition in rural Angola, score the winning goal for the most obscure Jamaican soccer team, and no such luck. The electronic teat fails again, at a cost of $300. So where was I meant to look for her, if not on the nets? Out in the world. But I couldn't scour the streets of Stateless. I invoked Witness again, and flagged the identikit image for continuous real-time search. If Kuale so much as appeared in the corner of my eye, whether or not I was recording and whether or not I noticed, Witness would let me know. Chapter 16. Carine de Groot led me into Violet Mosala's suite. Despite the difference in scale, it had the same sunny but Spartan feel as my own single room. A skylight added to the sense of space and light, but even this touch failed to create the impression of opulence which it might have, in another building, in another place. Nothing on Stateless appeared lavish to me, however grand, but I couldn't decide to what extent this judgment was the product of the architecture itself, and how much was due to an awareness of the politics and biotechnology which lay behind every surface. De Groot said, "Violet won't be long. Take a seat. She's talking to her mother, but I've already reminded her about the interview. Twice." It was 3 a.m. in South Africa. Has something happened? I can come back later. I didn't want to intrude in the middle of a family crisis. De Groot reassured me. "Everything's fine. Wendy keeps strange hours, that's all." I sat in one of the armchairs arranged in a cluster near the middle of the room. They looked like they might have been left that way after a meeting. Some kind of late-night brainstorming session. Between Mosala, Helen Wu, and a few other colleagues? Whoever it was, I should have been there, filming. I was going to have to push harder for access, or Mosala would keep me at a distance to the end. But I was going to have to win her confidence somehow, or pushing would only get me shut out even more. Mosala clearly had no particular desire for publicity, let alone the desperate need of a politician or a hack. The only thing I could offer her was the chance to communicate her work. De Groot remained standing, one hand on the back of a chair. I said, So how did you get to meet her?" "I answered an advertisement. I didn't know Violet personally before I took the job." "You have a science background too, though." She smiled. Too My background's probably more like yours than like Violet's. I have a degree in science and journalism. Did you ever work as a journalist? I was science correspondent for Proteus for 6 years. The charming Mr. Savimbi is my successor. I see. I strained my ears. I could just make out Mosala in the adjoining room, still talking. I said quietly, "What Savimbi said on Monday about death threats, was there anything in that?" De Groot eyed me warily. "Don't bring that up. Please. Do you really want to make everything as difficult as you possibly can for her?" I protested. "No, but put yourself in my position. Would you ignore the whole issue? I don't want to inflame the situation, but if some cultural purity group is issuing death sentences against Africa's top scientists, don't you think that's worthy of serious discussion?" De Groot said impatiently, "But they are not. For a start, the Stockholm quote was picked up and... Oh my gosh. For a start, the Stockholm quote was picked up and mangled by a Volksfront netzine, running the bizarre line that Violet was saying that the Nobel wasn't hers, wasn't Africa's, but really belonged to white intellectual culture, for which she was only a politically expedient figurehead. That story got taken up and echoed in other places, but nobody except the original audience would have believed for a second that it was anything but ludicrous propaganda. As for PACDF, they've never done so much as acknowledge Violet's existence." Okay, then what made Savimbi leap to the wrong conclusion? De Groot glanced toward the doorway. "Gobbled fifth-hand reports." Of what? Not just the netzine propaganda itself. He could hardly be that naive. De Groot leaned toward me with an anguished expression, torn in between discretion and the desire to set me straight. "She had a break-in, all right? A few weeks ago. A burglar. A teenage boy with a gun." "Shit. What happened? Was she hurt?" "No, she was lucky. Her alarm went off. He'd disabled one, but she had a backup, and there was a patrol car nearby at the time. The burglar told the police he'd been paid to frighten her, but he couldn't name names, of course. It was just a pathetic excuse." Then why should Savimbi take it seriously? And why fifth-hand reports? Surely he would have read the whole story. "Violet dropped the charges. She's an idiot, but that's the kind of thing she does. So there was no court appearance, no official version of events. But someone in the police must have leaked..." Mosala entered the room and we exchanged greetings. She glanced curiously at De Groot, who was still so close to me that it must have been obvious that we'd been doing our best to avoid being overheard. I moved to fill the silence. "How's your mother?" "She's fine. She's in the middle of negotiating a major deal with Thoughtcraft, though, so she's not getting much sleep." Wendy Mosala ran one of Africa's largest software houses. She'd built it up herself over 30 years from a one-person operation. "She's bidding for a license for the Caspar clonelets 2 years in advance of release, and if it all pans out..." She caught herself. "All of which is strictly confidential, okay?" "Of course." Caspar was the next generation of pseudo-intelligent software currently being coaxed out of a prolonged infancy in Toronto. Unlike Sisyphus and its numerous cousins, which had been created fully fledged, instantly, quote, adult, unquote, by design, Caspar was going through a learning phase, more anthropomorphically styled than anything previously attempted. Personally, I found it a little disquieting, and I wasn't sure that I wanted a clonelet, a pared-down copy of the original, sitting in my notepad, enslaved to some menial task, if the full software had spent a year singing nursery rhymes and playing with blocks. De Groot left us. Mosala slumped into a chair opposite me, spotlit by the sunshine flooding through the pane above. The call from home seemed to have lifted her spirits, but in the harsh light she looked tired. I said, "Are you ready to start?" She nodded, but smiled half-heartedly. "The sooner we start, the sooner it's over." I invoked witness. The shaft of sunlight would drift visibly in the course of the interview, but at the editing stage everything could be stripped back to reflectance values and recomputed with a fixed set of, rather more flattering, light sources. I said, "Was it your mother who first inspired you to take an interest in science?" Mosala scowled and said in disgusted tones, "I don't know. Was it your mother who inspired you to come up with that kind of pathetic..." She broke off, managing to look contrite and resentful at the same time. I'm sorry. Can we start again? No need. Don't worry about continuity. It's not your problem. Just keep on talking. And if you're halfway through an answer and you change your mind, just stop and start afresh. Okay. She closed her eyes and tilted her face wearily into the sunlight. My mother, my childhood, my role models. She opened her eyes and pleaded, Can't we just take all that bullshit as read and get on to the TOE? I said patiently, I know it's bullshit, you know it's bullshit, but if the network executives don't see the required quota of formative childhood influences, they'll screen you at 3 a.m. after a last-minute program change, having promoted the time slot as a special on drug-resistant skin diseases. CNET, who claimed the right to speak for all their viewers, of course, had a strict checklist for profiles. So many minutes on childhood, so many on politics, so many on current relationships, etc. A slick paint-by-numbers guide to commodifying human beings, as well as a template for deluding yourself into thinking that you'd explained them. A sort of externalized version of Lamont's area. Mosala said, 3 a.m.? You're serious, aren't you? She thought it over. Okay, if that's what it comes down to, I can play along. So tell me about your mother. I resisted the urge to say, feel free to answer more or less at random so long as you don't contradict yourself. She improvised fluently, churning out my life as a soundbite without a trace of detectable irony. My mother gave me an education, by which I don't mean school. She plugged me into the nets. She had me using an adult's knowledge miner by the time I was 7 or 8. She opened up the whole planet to me. I was lucky. We could afford it, and she knew exactly what she was doing. But she didn't steer me toward science. She gave me the keys to this giant playground and let me loose. I might just as easily have headed toward music, art, history, anything. I wasn't pushed in any direction. I was just set free. And your father? My father was in the police force. He was killed when I was 4. That must have been traumatic, but do you think that early loss might have given you the drive, the independence? Mosala flashed me a look more of pity than anger. My father was shot in the head by a sniper at a political rally, where he was helping to protect 20,000 people whose views he found completely repugnant. And, this is now off the record, by the way, whatever it means for your time slot, he was someone I loved, and who I still love. He was not an assembly of missing gears in my psychodynamic clockwork. He was not an absence to be compensated for. I felt myself flush with shame. I glanced down at my notepad and skipped over several equally fatuous questions. I could always pad out the interview material with reminiscences from childhood friends, stock footage of Cape Town schools in the 30s, whatever. You've said elsewhere that you were hooked on physics by the time you were 10. You knew it was what you wanted to do for the rest of your life, for purely personal reasons, to satisfy your own curiosity. But when do you think you began to consider the wider arena in which science operates? When did you start to become aware of the economic, social, and political factors? Mosala responded calmly, perfectly composed again. About 2 years later, I suppose. That was when I started reading Muteba Kazadi. She hadn't mentioned this in any of the earlier interviews I'd seen, and it was lucky I'd stumbled on the name when researching PACDF, or I would have looked extremely foolish at this point. Muteba who? So you were influenced by techno-liberation? Of course. She frowned slightly, bemused, as if I'd just asked her if she'd ever heard of Albert Einstein. I wasn't even sure if she was being honest, or whether she was just helpfully, cynically trying to accommodate CNET's demand for clichés, but then that was the price I paid for asking her to play the game. She said, Muteba spelled out the role of science more clearly than anyone else at the time, and in a couple of sentences he could incinerate any doubts I might have had about ransacking the entire planetary storehouse of culture and science and taking exactly what I wanted. She hesitated, then recited, When Leopold II rises from the grave, saying, "My conscience plagues me, take back this un-Belgian ivory and rubber and gold, then I will renounce my ill-gotten un-African gains, and piously abandon the calculus and all its offspring, to I know not whom, for Newton and Leibniz both died childless." I laughed. Mosala said soberly, "You've no idea what it was like, though, to have that one sane voice cutting through all the noise. The anti-science traditionalist backlash didn't really hit South Africa until the 40s, but when it did, so many people in public life who'd spoken perfect sense until then seemed to cave in one way or another, until science was somehow either the rightful property of the West, which Africa didn't need or want anyway, or it was nothing but a weapon of cultural assimilation and genocide. It has been used as exactly that." Mosala eyed me balefully. "No shit. Science has been abused for every conceivable purpose under the sun, which is all the more reason to deliver the power it grants to as many people as possible, as rapidly as possible, instead of leaving it in the hands of a few. It is not a reason to retreat into fantasy, to declare knowledge is a cultural artifact, nothing is universally true, only mysticism and obfuscation and ignorance will save us." She reached out and mimed taking hold of a handful of space, saying, "There is no male or female vacuum. There is no Belgian or Zairian space-time. Inhabiting this universe is not a cultural prerogative or a lifestyle decision. And I don't have to forgive or forget a single act of enslavement, theft, imperialism, or patriarchy in order to be a physicist, or to approach the subject with whatever intellectual tools I need. Every scientist sees further by standing on a pile of corpses, and frankly, I don't care what kind of genitals they had, what language they spoke, or what the color of their skin was." I tried not to smile. This was all highly usable. I had no idea which of these slogans were sincere and which were conscious theatrics, where the telegenic sugarcoating I'd asked for ended and Mosala's real passions began, but then she may not have been entirely clear about the borders herself. I hesitated. My next note read, "Emigration rumors?" Now was the logical time to raise the issue, but that progression could be reconstructed during editing. I wasn't going to risk blowing the interview until I had a lot more material safely in the can. I skipped ahead to safer ground. "I know you don't want to reveal the full details of your TOE before your lecture on the 18th, but maybe you could give me a rough sketch of the theory in terms of what's already been published." Mosala relaxed visibly. "Of course, though the main reason I can't give you all the details is that I don't even know them myself." She explained, "I've chosen the complete mathematical framework. All the general equations are fixed, but getting the specific results I need involves a lot of supercomputer calculations, which are in progress even as we speak. They should be completed a few days before the 18th, though, barring unforeseen disasters." "Okay, so tell me about the framework." "That part is extremely simple. Unlike Henry Buzo and Yasuko Nishide, I'm not looking for a way to make our Big Bang seem like less of a coincidence. Buzo and Nishide both take the view that an infinite number of universes must have arisen out of pre-space, freezing out of that perfect symmetry with different sets of physical laws. And they both aim to re-evaluate the probability of a universe more or less like our own being included in that infinite set. It's relatively easy to find a TOE in which our universe is possible, but freakishly unlikely. Buzo and Nishide define a successful TOE as one which guarantees that there are so many universes similar to our own that we're not unlikely at all. That we're not some kind of miraculous perfect bullseye on a metacosmic dartboard, but just one unexceptional point on a much larger target." I said, "A bit like proving, from basic astrophysical principles, that thousands of planets in the galaxy should have carbon and water-based life, and not just Earth." "Yes and no, because, yes, the probability of other Earth-like planets can be computed from theory alone, but it can also be validated by observation. We can observe billions of stars. We've already deduced the existence of a few thousand extrasolar planets, and eventually we'll visit some of them and find other carbon and water-based life. But, although there are no end of elegant frameworks for assigning probabilities to hypothetical other universes, there's no prospect of observing or visiting them, no conceivable method for checking the theory. So I don't believe we should choose a TOE on that basis. The whole point of moving beyond the standard unified field theory is that, 1, it's an ugly mess, and 2, you have to feed 10 completely arbitrary parameters into the equations to make them work. Melting total space into pre-space, moving to an all topologies model, gets rid of the ugliness and the arbitrary nature of the SUFT. But following that step by tinkering with the way you integrate across all of the topologies of pre-space, excluding certain topologies for no good reason, throwing out one measure and adopting a new one whenever you don't like the answers you're getting, seems like a retrograde step to me. And instead of setting the dials of the SUFT machine to 10 arbitrary numbers, you now have a sleek black box with no visible controls, apparently self-contained, but in reality, you're just opening it up and tearing out every internal component which offends you, to much the same effect. Okay, so how do you get around that? Mosala said, I believe we have to take a difficult stand and declare the probabilities just don't matter. Forget the hypothetical ensemble of other universes. Forget the need to fine-tune the Big Bang. This universe does exist. The probability of our being here is 100%. We have to take that as a given, instead of bending over backward trying to contrive assumptions which do their best to conceal the fact of that certainty. Forget fine-tuning the Big Bang. Take our own existence as given. The parallels with Conroy's spiel the night before were striking, but I should hardly have been surprised. The whole modus operandi of pseudoscience was to cling as closely as possible to the language and ideas of the orthodoxy of the day, to adopt appropriate camouflage. The ACs would have read every paper Mosala had published, but a similar ring to their words hardly granted their ideas the same legitimacy. And if they clearly shared her vehement distaste for the fantasy that every culture could somehow inhabit a cosmology of its own choosing, I didn't doubt for a moment that Mosala was infinitely more repelled by their alternative, in which a lone TOE specialist played an absolute monarch. Worse than a Belgian or Zairian space-time, a Buzo, Mosala, or Nishide cosmos. I said, so you take the universe for granted. You're against twisting the mathematics to conform to a perceived need to prove that what we see around us is likely. But you don't exactly go back to setting the dials on the SUFT machine either. No, I feed in complete descriptions of experiments instead. You choose the most general all topologies model possible, but you break the perfect symmetry by giving a 100% probability to the existence of various setups of experimental apparatus? Yes. Can I just... She rose from her chair and went into the bedroom, then returned with her notepad. She held up the screen for me. Here's one example. It's a simple accelerator experiment. A beam of protons and antiprotons collide at a certain energy, and a detector is used to pick up any positrons emitted from the point of collision at a certain angle, with a certain range of energies. The experiment itself has been carried out, in one form or another, for 80 or 90 years. The animation showed an architectural schematic of a full-sized accelerator ring, and zoomed in toward one of the several points where counter-rotating particle beams crossed, and spilt their debris into elaborate detectors. Now, I don't even try to model this entire setup, a piece of apparatus 10 kilometers wide, on a subatomic level, atom by atom, as if I needed to start with a kind of blank, naive TOE, which would somehow succeed in telling me that all the superconducting magnets would produce certain fields with certain measurable effects, and the walls of the tunnel would deform in certain ways due to the stresses imposed upon them, and the protons and antiprotons would circle in opposite directions. I already know these things. I already know all of those things, so I assign them a probability of 100%. I take these established facts as a kind of anchor, and then reach down to the level of the TOE, down to the level of infinite sums over all topologies. I calculate what the consequences of my assumptions are, And then I follow them all the way back up to the macroscopic level to predict the ultimate results of the experiment. How many times a second will the positron detector register an event? The graphics responded to her narration, zooming in from a schematic of the detector array crisscrossed with particle tracks down into the froth of the vacuum itself, 35 powers of 10 beyond the reach of vision, into the chaos of writhing wormholes and higher dimensional deformations. Color-coded by topological classification, a thrashing nest of brightly hued snakes blurring into whiteness at the center of the screen, where they moved and changed too rapidly to follow. But these otherwise perfectly symmetrical convulsions were forced to take heed of the certain existence of accelerator, magnets, and detector, a process hinted at by the panchromatic whiteness acquiring a specific blue tinge. And then the view pulled back, zooming out to an ordinary human scale again, to show the imprint of this sub-microscopic bias on the... let's try this all again. And then the view pulled back, zooming out to an ordinary human scale again, to show the imprint of this sub-microscopic bias on the detector circuitry's final, visible behavior. The animation, of course, was 90% metaphor, a colorful splash of poetic license. But a supercomputer somewhere was crunching away at the serious, unmetaphoric calculations which made these pictures more than stylish whimsy. And after all my hasty skimming of incomprehensible scientific papers, and all my agonizing over the near-impenetrable mathematics of ATMs, I thought I finally had a handle on Mosala's philosophy. I said tentatively, "So instead of thinking of pre-space as something from which the whole universe can be derived in one stroke, you see it more as a link between the kind of events we can observe with our raw senses. Something which glues together the particular set of macroscopic things we find in the world. A star full of fusing hydrogen and a human eye full of cold protein molecules are bridged across distances and energies, are able to coexist and affect each other because at the deepest level they both break the symmetry of pre-space in the same way." Mosala seemed pleased with this description. "A link, a bridge. Exactly." She leaned forward, reached over and took my hand. I glanced down, thinking, I'm in shot now, so this is unusable. She said, "Without pre-space to mediate between us, without an infinite mixture of topologies able to represent us all with a single flicker of asymmetry, nobody could even touch." But that's what the TOE is. And even if I'm wrong in every detail, and Buzo is wrong, and Nishide is wrong, and nothing is resolved for 1,000 years, I still know it's down there waiting to be found, because there has to be something which lets us touch. We broke off for a while, and Mosala called room service. After 3 days on the island, I still had no appetite, but I ate a few of the snacks she offered me from the tray which emerged from the service chute, just to be polite. My stomach began protesting, loudly, as soon as I swallowed the first mouthful, rather defeating the point. Mosala said, "Did you know that Yasuko hasn't arrived yet? I don't suppose you've heard what's holding him up." "I'm afraid not. I've left 3 messages with his secretary in Kyoto trying to schedule an interview, and all I've got back are promises that he'll be in touch with me very soon." "It's odd." She pursed her lips, obviously concerned, but trying not to plunge the conversation into gloom. "I hope he's all right. I heard he's been sick for a while early in the year, but he assured the conveners that he'd be here, so he must have expected to be well enough to travel." I said, "Travel to Stateless is more than travel." "That's a point. He should have pretended to belong to humble science and stolen a ride on one of their charter flights. He might have had better luck with mystical renaissance. He's a self-described Buddhist, so they almost forgive him for working on the TOEs. So long as he didn't remind them that he once wrote that the Tao of physics was to Zen what a creation science biology text was to Christianity." I'm going to reread that because I just mangled the crap out of that sentence. My apologies. I don't know, I got lost in there. Completely. The meaning elided me. I misused that word, it's okay. He might have had better luck with mystical renaissance. He's a self-described Buddhist, so they almost forgive him for working on TOEs. So long as he didn't remind them that he once wrote that the Tao of physics was to Zen what a creation science biology text was to Christianity. Mosala reached up and started massaging the back of her neck, as if talk of the journey was rekindling its symptoms. I would have brought Pinda if the flight had been shorter. She would have loved it here. Left me to my boring lectures and dragged her father off to explore the reefs. How old is she? 3 and a bit. She glanced at her watch and complained wistfully, It's still only 4 in the morning back home. Not much chance of a call from her for 2 or 3 hours. It was another opportunity to raise the emigration rumors, but I held off yet again. We resumed the interview. The beam from the skylight had shifted to the east, leaving Mosala almost silhouetted against the window and a dazzling blue sky. When I invoked Witness again, it reached up into my retinas and made some adjustments, enabling me to register the fine details of her face in spite of the backlighting. I moved on to the question of Helen Wu's analysis. Mosala explained, My TOE predicts the outcome of various experiments, given a detailed description of the apparatus involved. Details which betray clues about the less fundamental physics which, some people insist, a TOE is meant to pull out of thin air all by itself. But unraveling those clues certainly isn't trivial. You or I can't just glance at an idle particle accelerator and predict, instantly, the outcome of any experiment which might be performed with the machine. But a supercomputer programmed with your TOE can. So is that good, bad, or indifferent? Are you guilty of circular logic or not? Mosala seemed unsure of the verdict herself. Helen and I have been talking it over, trying to thrash out exactly what it means. I have to confess that I started out resenting what she was doing, and then ignoring most of her later work. Now, though, I'm beginning to find it very exciting. Why? She hesitated. It was clear that her ideas on this were too new, too unformed. She really didn't want to say anything more. But I waited patiently, without prompting her, and she finally relented. Ask yourself this. If Buzo or Nishide can come up with a TOE in which the whole universe is more or less implicit in a detailed description of the Big Bang, details deduced, right here and now, from observations of helium abundance, galactic clustering, the cosmic background radiation, and so on, no one accuses them of circular logic. Feeding in the results of any number of telescope experiments is fine, apparently. So why is it any more circular to have a TOE in which the universe is implicit in the details of 10 contemporary particle physics experiments? I said, Okay, but isn't Helen Wu saying that your equations have virtually no physical content at all? I mean, no amount of pure mathematics could ever produce Newton's law of gravity, because there's no purely mathematical reason why the inverse square law couldn't be replaced by something different. The whole basis for it lies in the way the universe happens to work. Isn't Wu trying to show that your TOE doesn't rely on anything out there in the world? That it collapses into a lot of statements about numbers which simply have to be true? Mosala replied, frustrated, Yes, but even if she's right, when those statements which have to be true are coupled with real tangible experiments, which are very much out there in the world, the theory ceases to be pure mathematics, in the same way that the pure symmetry of pre-space ceases to be symmetrical. Newton came up with the inverse square law by analyzing existing astronomical observations. By treating the solar system in the way I treat a particle accelerator, saying, This much we know for a fact. Later, the law was used to make predictions, and those predictions turned out to be correct. Okay, but where exactly does the physical content reside in that whole process? With the inverse square law itself, or with the observed motions of the planets, from which that equation was deduced in the first place? Because if you stop treating Newton's law as something given, standing outside the whole show as an eternal truth, and look at the link, the bridge, between all the fundamental planets orbiting different stars, coexisting in the same universe, having to be consistent with each other, what you're doing starts to become much more like pure mathematics. I thought I had an inkling of what she was suggesting. It's a bit like saying that the general principle that people form net clans with other people with whom they have something in common has nothing to do with what those common interests happen to be. Exactly the same process brings together fans of Jane Austen or students of the genetics of wasps or whatever. Right. Jane Austen belongs to all the people who read her, not to the sociological principle which suggests that they'll get together to discuss her books. And the law of gravity belongs to all the systems which obey it, not to a TOE which predicts that they'll get together to form a universe. And maybe the theory of everything should collapse into nothing but statements about numbers which have to be true. Maybe pre-space itself has to melt into nothing but simple arithmetic, simple logic, leaving us with no choices to make about its structure at all. I laughed. I think even CNET's audience might have some trouble wrapping their minds around that. I certainly did. Look, maybe it's going to take a while for you and Helen Wu to make sense of all this. We can always do an update on it back in Cape Town if it turns out to be an important development. Mosala agreed, relieved. Throwing ideas around was one thing, but she clearly didn't want to take a position on this officially. Not yet. Before I could lose my nerve, I said, "Do you think you'll still be living in Cape Town in 6 months' time?" I'd braced myself for the kind of outburst the word Anthrocosmologist had produced, but Mosala simply observed dryly, "Well, I didn't think it could remain a secret for long. I suppose the whole conference is talking about it." "Not exactly. I heard it from a local." She nodded, unsurprised. "I've been having discussions with the academic syndicates here for months, so it's probably all over the island by now." She flashed a wry smile. "Not much into confidentiality, these anarchists. But what can you expect from patent violators and intellectual property thieves?" I said, "So what's the attraction?" She stood. "Can you stop recording, please?" I complied. "When all the details have been worked out, I'll make a public statement. But I don't want some off-the-cuff remark on the subject coming out first." "I understand." She said, "What's the attraction of patent violators and intellectual property thieves? That very fact. Stateless is renegade. They flout the biotech licensing laws." She turned toward the window and stretched out her arms. "And look at them. They're not the wealthiest people on the planet, but no one here is starving. No one. That's not true in Europe, Japan, Australia, let alone in Angola, Malawi." She trailed off and studied me for a moment, as if trying to decide if I really had stopped filming, if she should really trust me at all. I waited. She continued. "What's that got to do with me? My own country's doing well enough. I'm not exactly in danger of malnutrition, am I?" She closed her eyes and groaned. This is very hard for me to say, but like it or not, the Nobel Prize has given me a certain kind of power. If I move to Stateless and state the reasons why, it will make news. It will make an impact in certain places." She hesitated again. I said, "I can keep my mouth shut." Mosala smiled faintly. "I know that. I think. So what kind of impact do you want to make?" She walked over to the window. I said, "Is this some kind of political gesture against traditionalists like PACDF?" She laughed. No. Well, maybe it will be that as well, coincidentally. But that's not the point." She steeled herself. "I've had assurances from a number of highly placed people. I've been promised that if I move to Stateless, not because I matter, but because it will make news and create a pretext, the South African government will unilaterally drop all sanctions against the island within 6 months." I had goosebumps. One country might make no difference, except that South Africa was the major trading partner of about 30 other African nations. Mosala said quietly, "The voting patterns in the UN don't show it, but the fact is, the anti-sanctions faction is not a tiny minority. At present, there's all kinds of bloc solidarity and surface agreement, because everyone believes they can't win, and they don't want to cause offense. But if someone gave the right little push, they might start an avalanche? Maybe." She laughed, embarrassed. "Talk about delusions of grandeur. The truth is, I get sick to the core every time I think about it, and I don't actually believe anything dramatic is going to happen. One person to break the symmetry. Why not?" She shook her head firmly. There have been other attempts to shift the vote, which have all fallen through. Anything's worth trying, but I have to keep my feet on the ground. Several things were running through my mind at once, though what might happen if the biotech patent laws ever really collapsed globally was almost too distant a prospect to contemplate. But the fact remained that Mosala had more use for the documentary than I'd ever imagined. And she'd told me all this to let me know as much, to give me the leverage she wanted me to employ, to ensure that her emigration did cause a stir. It was also clear that the whole endeavor, however quixotic, or quixotic, depending on how you decide to pronounce that, I've heard it both ways, quixotic, would be extremely unpopular in certain quarters. Was that what Kuwale had had in mind? Not the ignorance cults, not PACDF fundamentalists, not even pro-science South African nationalists outraged by Mosala's desertion, but powerful defenders of the biotech status quo? And if the teenage burglar, paid to frighten her, hadn't been lying after all? Mosala walked over to a side table and poured herself a glass of water. Gulp. "Now you know all my deepest secrets, so I declare this interview over." She raised the glass and declaimed self-mockingly, "Vive la technolibération!" "Vive." She said seriously, "Okay, there are rumors. Maybe half of Stateless knows exactly what's going on, but I still don't want those rumors confirmed until certain arrangements, certain agreements, are much more solid." I understand. And I realized, with a kind of astonishment, that somewhere along the way I'd won some measure of trust from her. Of course she was using me, but she must have believed that my heart was in the right place, that I'd let myself be used. I said, "Next time you're arguing circularity with Helen Wu deep into the night, do you think I could sit in and record it?" She seemed to find the prospect dubious, but she said, "All right, just so long as you promise not to fall asleep before we do." She walked me to the door, and we shook hands. I said, "Be careful." She smiled serenely, slightly amused at my concern, as if she didn't have an enemy in the world. "Don't worry, I will." Jeez. That's right up. I can't, unfortunately, read the next chapter. I don't quite have time. But we will be back in, 3 days? Yeah, jeez, 3 days. Let me look at a calendar here. Let me just double check. My work schedule just sucks lately. I'm usually able to get at least 3 days in a week, but not always. Yeah. So Thursday, Friday, the 19th and 20th of March, we will continue. But yeah. What does this have to do with distress? This weird new neurological disease that's going around with no apparent viral vector? Who knows? Who can say? I wonder if we have more things in
store for us. Anyway, I've got to run. I know this was a short one. A lot of these have been short. That's the way the cookie has been crumbling of late. My time is not my own. We will continue this in 3 days' time. All right. Thank you to everyone who tunes in. You're appreciated and stuff. If you want to have discussions about books that I've read with me in more or less real time, outside of the comments section of the videos themselves, you can feel free to join the Discord. You don't have to. I understand anyone's reticence to join or utilize Discord. I totally get it. I happen to because it's convenient, but as soon as a superior or even not quite, or even slightly inferior option shows its head, I will probably be converting to that, and I'll post information on that as and where it needs to be posted. So yeah, with that, stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other, and I'll see you all next time. Toodaloo!